If we really adopted Fisher's method and applied another principle that's often promoted in science, it's the idea of repeating and repeating experiments. We would inevitably end up refuting any hypothesis. If I want to test the impact of social networks on mental health, it's unimaginable to take a population and force some to look at social networks and forbid others. These are cases where the scientific method just isn't applicable. There are leaks, internal documents from these industries that show these industries were aware of the problems. Decades before scientists were aware of the problem.
Hello everyone, welcome to this new episode. Today we have Leah Nguyen, mathematician and videographer, with whom we will talk about mathematics and artificial intelligence. Hello Leah, hello, we are very happy to have you with us today. So for those who don't know you yet, could you introduce yourself?
I'm Leah Nguyen, I'm a researcher in mathematics and computer science. I'm also a member of the Orange Ethics Committee and also a member of the Tournesol Association, which develops digital solutions and independent researchers on issues related to artificial intelligence in particular.
Okay, so you also have a YouTube channel? Yes, it's called Science for All. And so what do we see on this channel?
So it's a science popularization channel, which, as the name doesn't really suggest, isn't always completely for all. I admit that. It's a channel where I like to explore both important concepts in computer science and mathematics, but also the whole aspect of social impact. Since today, digital technology is really deeply intertwined with life.
Yes, so we're going to go back a bit to these questions of computer science and digital technology, but there's also a theme that has been greatly developed on the channel, and that's Bayesianism. So it's short, actually. How could we sum it up?
So Bayesianism is a philosophy of knowledge, meaning it's a way of asking the question of how to know what is the right approach to follow in order to reach reliable conclusions. And the answer from Bayesianism is extremely appealing for a mathematician, since it boils down to saying that you have to apply the laws of probability. So that's the somewhat simple, attractive version. But when you get into the details, of course, there are a lot of complications, especially. There's always this aspect that's a bit complicated to address, which is somewhat debated, which is the problem of preconceived notions. That is to say, in Bayesianism, you always need a starting point, and the observational data will modify that starting point. And that can give an impression of subjectivity, which is not denied by many Bayesians, not by me, that is to say, indeed, in Bayesianism, at least according to some, according to me. In any case, knowledge depends on the observer, and in particular, on the data to which the observer has had access.
All right, so basically it's a way of approaching a problem using a probabilistic approach. That's it?
That's it, and so there's really this aspect. We're really going to emphasize the importance of reasoning with uncertainty. That's something that came up in 2019 there was, statisticians wrote, they kind of gathered together. So the American statistician, the journal wanted to focus on statistics in the service of the scientific method, because there's this whole debate today about the statistical method, which is currently predominant, and it's not Bayesian, which is based on what's called the p-value and on statistical significance, which has a rather specific meaning. And basically it's highly debated. And there was this journal that did a kind of special edition with about 50 statistics researchers who contributed to try to explain how to better use statistics for the scientific method, especially to avoid false positives. Because there are a lot of scientific results that are published, but actually we realize that they're not reliable enough, and there are plenty of reasons for that, but especially the statistical method has been criticized. And the number one piece of advice that really comes out of this is to accept uncertainty. That's really the number one advice. You have to accept that you need to reason with uncertainty. Another report that does this extremely well is all the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. When they try to talk about threats and talk about the future, there's a probabilistic language that's extremely pronounced. That is, there are scenarios that are almost certain, nearly certain aspects of future scenarios. There are conceivable scenarios that will, for example, depend a lot on the energy transition and therefore have much more uncertainty attached to them. And then, for example, there are also extreme cases with potentially feedback loops that we still don't fully understand, which may be unlikely. We're really not sure that it's actually a problem, but it's something we can't rule out, and the consequences could be truly catastrophic. It's important to keep that in mind, to tell ourselves that we still need to prepare for the maybe 1% chance that things could go really, really badly. It's really this whole logic of reasoning with uncertainty that's at the heart of Bayesianism.
All right, so earlier we contrasted Bayesianism with the more traditional approach of statistics. First, can we talk a little about the context, the background up to now? How did we do science, draw conclusions, and determine if something was true or false?
Yes, so really it changed a lot in the 20th century. Before the 20th century, in the 19th century, it was much less standardized. Statistics usage was not very standardized. And in the 20th century, there was one statistician in particular, Ronald Fisher. He wasn't the only one, but he really laid the most groundwork. The problem of the reliability of science, of having a very standardized and highly mathematized scientific approach. And for him, there are several principles. The first, one of the basic principles, is to conduct controlled experiments and, if possible, randomized ones. That is to say, if we want to test the impact of an intervention, we will create two groups. One group on which we will carry out the intervention and one group on which we will not. And then we will compare the results by looking at what happened in both groups. And what Fisher said is that it's very important to make sure that the way someone is assigned to one of the two groups is random, is due to chance, to avoid what we call confounding factors. That is, if there is a reason why a person will systematically receive the intervention and get better. Afterwards, we might wonder if it's because of the intervention or if it's because there were factors that led them to be in that group. So these are very important aspects of the scientific method. And then another aspect is that we might observe that the group with the intervention is doing better than the group without the intervention. But we're going to ask ourselves whether it's just due to chance, whether it's just luck, or if it's really something reliable. We expect it to persist even if we repeat the experiment. And so, to be able to answer this second question, Fisher introduced a method where we calculate a somewhat complicated object, which is called the p-value, or what we call today the p-value, which is an object. So if I put it very roughly and quickly, it's by assuming if we imagined an imaginary world where the intervention had zero effect, what is the probability that we would observe such a difference, basically, in the result?
Actually, it's the measure of noise,
It's the measure of noise. But in an imaginary world where the intervention has no effect, that's where it gets a bit tricky. We live at this stage, but imagine a world where the intervention has no effect. We ask ourselves how likely it is to have such a pronounced result, and if the fact that the result is so pronounced is unlikely. In this imaginary world, Fisher's idea is to say that we reject this imaginary world. Rejecting the imaginary world means rejecting the world where, as a result, the intervention has no effect. That amounts to concluding that the intervention has an effect. It's a bit twisted, it's a bit of mental gymnastics, you have to keep track of it. But it's somewhat similar to Popper's approach, to Popper's philosophy, where we try to refute a hypothesis. For that, we're really going to put ourselves in a world where the hypothesis is true. We sometimes call it H0, which is the hypothesis stating the intervention has no effect. And we're going to try to reject it by asking ourselves, are the data completely contradictory, sufficiently improbable in this imaginary world, in this world where H0 is true?
D'accord.
And so this approach has really become extremely predominant in science today. It's really the basic method, especially in science, in experimental science. In formal science, it's something else, of course, but in experimental science, it's become extremely standard. But I would say from the 1990s and even more so now, we're seeing a reproducibility crisis. That is, many of the results where it was concluded that the intervention had an effect, when the experiment is repeated, in fact, the effect is no longer observed. And so we end up thinking that the method Fisher recommended isn't as reliable as we thought.
But then, is it a problem with the method, or is it just the threshold we originally set?
Maybe a bit too low. That's a good question. The threshold is clearly too low. That is, we tend to want the acceptance threshold too much. We accept the rejection of this imaginary world of the null hypothesis too often. That's an arbitrary threshold Ronald Fisher chose. This is especially true in sciences where the threshold is set at 5%, meaning that in 5% of experiments where the null hypothesis 0 is true, in other words, where the intervention has no effect, we would have reached an incorrect conclusion. So that was the threshold chosen by Fisher, which became a standard 5%, that's 1 chance in 20. That means if I do an experiment 20 times on something where I'm sure it has no effect, but I do 20 different experiments in practice, we test a lot of things. By the 20th experiment, we end up with a result that's going to be publishable. And so in practice, we multiply the experiments in research labs, so we quickly end up publishing results that are publishable. That's one aspect, but even beyond that, there are more subtle things. And even in physics, where the threshold is much lower, in physics, we can repeat experiments much more often. Because if you're in the humanities, doing an experiment means taking a human and taking their time. And so often paying them. On top of that, it can raise other ethical issues, so it's quite costly. In physics, if you launch photons, you can launch billions. It works well. And since we have a lot more data in physics, we can lower the threshold much more. But even in physics, when we lower the threshold a lot, there's still the problem. Even if it only takes launching 1 billion photons to reach that threshold, you can do 1 billion experiments 20 times. I mean, you can really do a lot of experiments at CERN, for example. There are many things being observed at the same time, so there is still the multiplicity of experiments that have taken place. And beyond that, there's something more subtle, which is that when we test the imaginary world or the case where the intervention has no effect, actually, we assume a lot of things for it to have no effect. All the sensors, all the machines also have to work as they are supposed to. There are no other errors in the experiment. And in practice, there can be plenty of disturbances that mean that even in these cases in physics, we observe an error rate that is much higher than what theory is supposed to guarantee. So besides that, there are other problems, especially what we call p-hacking. In practice, there's really an inevitable publication bias. If we have something uninteresting, we don't publish or submit it. And if we discover something, that isn't enough to reject a hypothesis. We do an experiment, we have data, but it doesn't allow us to reject the hypothesis. There are a few mechanisms to value this work. So this data is kind of lost. Researchers who find this kind of data that can't be published, there's no place to publish this data, so it's kind of lost. And so it creates a focal effect. It gives much more attention to results that are statistically significant, and that means these statistically significant results can be hacked. People might want to. Researchers can, consciously or not, develop strategies to multiply experiments in order to increase the number of p-values they calculate and raise the probability of finding one. Finally, one that's correct and below the threshold. They find there are plenty of mechanisms that are quite problematic then. For example, you can demonstrate some pretty strange theorems. For example, if we really adopted Fisher's method, yes. And if we apply another principle that is often promoted in science, which is to repeat and repeat experiments, we would inevitably end up refuting any hypothesis, because every time we do an experiment, there's always a strictly positive probability that it will be rejected. So I do it today, and if I don't succeed, I try again tomorrow, and so on. Well, in this case, it might be silly to say that I myself will repeat the thing. Actually, in practice, it's not only me repeating the experiment. It's armies of scientists, each testing a different aspect of a theory. And it only takes one of these experiments out of the thousands that have taken place around the world to find a strictly positive result to, in principle, reject the theory. And so even if it's true, we expect there to be many publications that actually say it's false. If we strictly applied the scientific method.
All right, but then if we know that it biases the results, why haven't we put it in place then? Either another statistical approach or having publication methods. Something that also goes the other way.
There are several answers. The first answer is that it's just hard. It's really extremely difficult to do good science. For example, there are books that are very much in the logic. I sometimes call it frequentist. In any case, really the Popperian logic. First of all, they point out that in some cases, this idea of doing controlled group experiments is just inapplicable. For example, if I want to test the effect of tobacco on the population, ideally I would need to take a part of the population randomly, and I force them to smoke for 30 years, and the other group, I force them not to smoke for 30 years. And in the end, I try to measure things. That's completely unthinkable, same thing. I don't know if I want to test the impact of social networks on mental health. It's unimaginable to take a group of people, force some to look at social networks, and forbid others from doing so. These are cases where the scientific method just isn't applicable, and that caused a lot of problems in history. P.R. Fisher was a big fan of tobacco, and he also had contracts with the tobacco industry. And strangely, he insisted a lot on his method by saying that tobacco couldn't be concluded to be carcinogenic because a randomized controlled trial hadn't been done. That's also a tactic used by the tobacco lobbies. That's where it gets complicated. There's vulnerability to lobbying. If I want to do better. Another aspect is that if I take a very good book called All of Statistics by Larry Wasserstein, or Wasserman, sorry, I don't remember. It's a fairly classic statistics book that talks a lot about these aspects. And there's a part that says if we want to accept a scientific theory, we not only need statistical results that support it, but also if we want to reject it. Who tries to suggest that it's false? But we also need scientific explanations, scientific mechanisms that seem quite credible. And when you really read the quote, which I don't necessarily remember off the top of my head here, but when you read the quote, the words are really there. I said, for example, that it seems credible. Those aren't exactly the words he uses, but it's kind of the type of words he uses. They're terms that are extremely subjective, that don't correspond to a predefined method. So here, the best advice from statisticians, and it's the same. That's also what you find in the editorial of the Journal of the Special Edition on Statistics 2019. You have to include scientific knowledge in the analysis of the results, which means taking into account the current state of knowledge. But of course, it's going to be subjective. It's going to be hard to know what's really true. In some fields. It's pretty easy in math. It's not too hard in physics. It's okay. When you get into stories, in economics, for example, it quickly becomes very complicated.
And so Bayesianism stands in opposition. It brings a solution to these problems.
Bayesianism fully recognizes the importance of including the state of scientific knowledge. That's what we call priors in Bayesian language. And so it won't solve this aspect. It will just admit that it's an important aspect. But everyone can have their own personal construction of what they consider to be the most justified state of knowledge today. And then above all, Bayesianism will add an extra layer of uncertainty. That is, instead of concluding that a theory is, or wanting to reject a theory, for example, there's this phrase that's often said in science that many popular science editors say, which is that a scientific theory is true. Until proven otherwise, that's completely rejected by Bayesianism, which says that there is no binary conclusion. And it's more that a theory is more or less credible given the current state of knowledge. That's more the language we should adopt. A theory today is credible given what we know.
All right, I understand. The basic approach is to find out whether it's true or false, whether it works or it doesn't work. That's where the more Bayesian approach works by level of certainty. Do we trust something more or less?
See, in any case, that's one of the founding principles that make the difference between the most promoted approaches. As for the frequentist approach, it's not very easy to define exactly what the frequentist approach is. But overall, the predominant approach in science today, which is becoming less and less so, is the more Bayesian approach, where, for example, not only do we reason much more with uncertainty, but we also try out these priors. The current state of knowledge is taken much more into account in the analysis of the data we have right now. And then there are also other aspects that can come later. These are major debates about the epistemology of science. But for example, the idea that things must be refutable by experience. In fact, there are many sciences that cannot be subjected to experience. All the sciences that analyze the past, for example, so it can be from history to ontological inquiry to geology, including cosmology, for example, all these sciences are not suited to experimentation. We're not going to repeat a Big Bang. Well, at least I don't have the means. And so they require different ways of thinking, which are in any case scientific methods, but they're not the ones promoted by the at least naive version of the randomized controlled experiment.
All right, so are there concrete problems that we can't solve with the classical approach, but for which Bayesianism offers a solution?
I would say it's more about mindsets than actual solutions. Well, there are some things that are a bit more concrete, for example. Bayesianism is very good. Well, it has been a very good foundation for massive data analysis. And that's something, for example, you find a lot of Bayesianism in everything related to machine learning today. So, for example, if you look at chatbots today, ChatGPT and so on, in fact, they are designed on a fundamentally Bayesian principle, which is about predicting the next word. So it's a fundamentally probabilistic language. And actually, if you look at the core of how it works, it's almost Bayes' formula that's applied to train the models. So it's the same, and you find the same thing in lots of applications on social networks. For example, in the Tournesol project, guessing what people will prefer, that kind of thing, you find a lot of Bayesian principles. So here it's kind of one of the cases where Bayesianism is operational, let's say, but there's an approach, a mindset that's a bit more general. For example, if I take another problem that's quite controversial today, which is the impact of social networks on mental health, that's an extremely important problem. I think so. Today, it's really one of the most important things because we're talking about the mental health of the entire world population, so that's a lot. And if we try to approach it naively with the classic methods of science, it's so tempting to say we don't know, and we see a lot of scientists saying we don't know. This suspension of judgment, which is somewhat related to the phrase true until proven otherwise, this attitude, we refuse to reason with uncertainty, we don't even make a judgment, we just say I don't know. Whereas if we approach it, we go with a more Bayesian approach. There's more of this kind of reflection. With the data I have today, how do I update my view on the impact of social networks on mental health? So very concretely, the fact that social networks themselves are extremely closed off, and they absolutely refuse to collaborate, to communicate, and to make their data accessible to independent researchers. Researchers often select collaborators with conflicts of interest. 1/3 of scientific articles on social networks have undeclared conflicts of interest. There's a big problem surrounding all of this. But that means that if we take the Bayesian approach, monopoly of compromising access about him, and if he refuses to give them to me, the fact that he refuses to give them is data. And from a Bayesian point of view, the probability that he refuses to give me his data, knowing that he is guilty, is much higher than knowing that he is innocent. If he is innocent, it means he would be much more likely to share his data. And so with the Bayesian approach, we can much more strongly conclude that it's likely that social networks have quite a negative impact. That's an example where adopting a more Bayesian approach seems important to me.
And I would even say it's much deeper than we think, because if we come in with a frequentist approach, is it true or is it false? That is to say, in everything that is not repeatable, but also in everything that contains uncertainty. So, as we said, social networks, climate issues, actually a lot of things of the same kind. By refraining from drawing a conclusion, we also refrain from considering solutions. Because we tell ourselves that if we can't think it through, we stay in a sort of intermediate status quo where we don't really do much.
Yes, exactly. I think that's really an important aspect, I think. The simplest way to describe Bayesianism is to say that we want to make the language of probabilities the language of knowledge. And anything that isn't in that language shouldn't be part of it, shouldn't be our way of speaking. The idea is, I refrain from concluding because we lack enough evidence. That's ignoring probabilistic reasoning. That's not adopting the language of probabilities. And I think this has become very important, especially in a world where many important questions don't lend themselves to randomized controlled experiments.
So it's very interesting. And I think what can be even more interesting is to try to see how we can actually implement this way of thinking in the decisions we make. So now I'm getting to the practical part. There's a specific issue I've heard you talk about on your channel. It's the Monty Hall problem, a problem where we can use a Bayesian approach to try to find a solution. Can I let you summarize what the Monty Hall problem is?
The Monty Hall problem, it's a game show that took place in the United Kingdom. So the host is kind of a big deal. The host has a contestant play a game. And in the game, there are 3 curtains, and the contestant has to choose one of the curtains. And Monty Hall won't reveal right away. Monty Hall, the host, won't reveal directly what's behind the curtain. The contestant would have won. To build suspense, he will show one curtain, and what you need to know is that behind the curtains, so there are 3 curtains, there's a car behind one of the curtains, and a goat behind each of the other 2. And so Monty Hall, to build suspense, will choose to show what's behind one curtain, and of course he'll choose carefully. He won't pick a curtain with the car behind it, because that would ruin the suspense. He'll pick the curtain hiding the goat, and then he will offer the contestant the chance to potentially change their mind. So there are only 2 curtains left, the one he originally chose and the other curtain. So the question for the contestant is it better to stick with their initial intuition, their original choice? Or is it only the curtains that don't change their mind? Shouldn't he change his choice of curtain? And what's quite unsettling is that there really is a correct answer. You have to change your choice of curtain. Changing the curtain doubles our odds of winning. And it's extremely counterintuitive. It's extremely counterintuitive to the point where some of the greatest mathematicians in history, I'm thinking especially of Paul Erdos, couldn't understand it. Who was really very good at mathematics, but very bad at probabilistic reasoning. Really, he just couldn't do it. He had to do experiments, repeat experiments, to see that indeed by switching, you double your chances of winning. You might wonder why there are several explanations. There are explanations. For example, if you try to think about the situations where you win, depending on your initial choice, from the very beginning, you chose the curtain with the car behind it. By switching, you're sure to lose, but that only happens 1 time out of 3 because there are 3 initial curtains, so it's only 1 out of 3. Choisissez dès le début la voiture. If from the start you choose a curtain without the car, you can think about it a bit. So Monterol will remove the curtain that has neither the car nor the one you chose. By switching, you win the car. So if from the start you didn't choose the car, by switching, you're sure to win. That happens 2 times out of 3. So these are 2 ways of reasoning that help you understand why switching doubles your chances of winning. But that's not really the answer that matches Bayesian logic. Bayesian logic is that you didn't know initially. You have a 1 in 3 chance with the different curtains. You picked one, there's still a 1 in 3 chance. The fact that you picked one doesn't change the probability of the car. But on the other hand, the question for you from a Bayesian point of view is, how does the fact that Monterol reveals one of the curtains affect the probability of the car being somewhere else, which is a bit more difficult? It takes time to really do the right reasoning, Bayesian reasoning. The question you need to ask yourself is, the fact that Monterol is removing this curtain, was it more likely in a world where the car was where you chose? Or was it more likely in the case where the car was in the middle? Or was it likelier in a world where the car was on the right? The car on the right. It's unlikely because he removes that curtain, because he wouldn't remove the curtain and the car. And if the car was all the way to the left, if the car was in the middle, obviously he had no choice, he had to remove that curtain. On the other hand, if the car was where you chose, the probability that he removes this curtain is actually 1 in 2, because he could have removed the other curtain. And so the fact that he removes this curtain is twice as likely when the car is in the middle. When the car is on the left, it's much harder to reason like that. I'm not saying it's the easiest approach, but it's the most accurate. It uses probability laws and lets you generalize to other cases.
Which means that each element, each additional piece of information can have an impact on the final probabilities of the different choices available to us.
That's right. And each time, the mental gymnastics you have to do, which really isn't easy, is to tell yourself, with each piece of data I observe, I imagine several possible worlds that are likely. Is this piece of data likely in this imaginary world? Is it likely in that imaginary world? Is it likely in another imaginary world? You have to imagine how likely they are in different imaginary worlds. The imaginary worlds where the data is very likely will become more credible, and the others, by comparison, will become less credible.
With each new experiment, we readjust the different probability levels. It seems quite similar to artificial intelligence in some ways, I think.
Yes, a lot in artificial intelligence, artificial intelligence. Today, when we talk about artificial intelligence, we often think of learning systems, meaning systems that will change based on new data. And for a long time, research in artificial intelligence has always been obsessed with the question of what is the right way to modify. Does the algorithm or artificial intelligence update with each new processed data? And I want to say that Bayesianism has already answered this question in a certain sense by stating the correct answer is to use probability laws. But this answer isn't satisfying for another reason, which is that the computation time is huge, the time it takes to be able to. You have to imagine all the hypotheses, imagine every possible imaginary world, and then calculate this probability each time for all the imaginary worlds. In practice, the number of possible imaginary worlds. Well, actually, it's exponential, so it's impossible to consider them all. And even calculating how likely the data is in an imaginary world can also be a calculation that's impossible to do. That's why very quickly artificial intelligence researchers also said we need to find other methods to be able to update. It's a technical term, updating systems that are learning based on new data. And I would add on top of that that there are new issues that have come up, that have emerged. Following the deployment of these artificial intelligences, there are issues of security and confidentiality. That means typically we want the model to learn from data, but if the data is actually malicious, if it's injected by a cyber attacker, for example, well, I don't want that to mess up my system, so I want it to change my system. It's supposed to change my system, but I want the change not to be completely harmful. So that's a whole field of research in learning, especially in artificial intelligence regarding poison data. A whole field of research that I've done a lot of research on. And then there's also the problem of confidentiality, meaning that confidential data can emerge. And we want the system to learn from this data, but not memorize it, or not learn too much from this data. And so that raises other problems. How can we learn things without learning certain things? It's complicated, but these are very active areas of research today.
I read an article about that where apparently they ask questions to LLMs like ChatGPT, but by asking certain questions in a certain way, they managed to get email addresses and passwords to come up. And so that's because of the way the large language model was trained. That's it?
Yes. So that means that companies, basically, we know that the best way to learn today, if the goal is to learn without paying attention to what we're learning. And actually today there are, security standards have dropped in all digital companies, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence. And we know that these systems are trained on massive amounts of data that are downloaded from the internet. And we can even wonder if there isn't more sensitive data. For example, the conversation history on generative pre-trained transformer, or even emails, for example, that we exchange on Gmail. There hasn't been any communication about that. In principle, they're not doing anything too reckless, but in any case, even in the data, on Twitter or even on Wikipedia, not so much on Wikipedia, but on blog articles, there is potentially personal data. Either the person reveals personal things themselves, or there could be doxing. Some people reveal personal information about others. In the history with generative pre-trained transformer, who knows how careful people are with what they share? Are their credit cards being exchanged? These are data that in any case, it's very likely that the companies learning from this data don't label it as sensitive.
Et apprennent globalement de ces données.
We know that to learn, the best thing is to learn and even to memorize. These systems tend to memorize a lot of their data. And so it raises the question, if we now ask them, what is Christopher's credit card number? Well,
Bon,
it would be good if they didn't give it.
I'd prefer that.
It's a whole problem figuring out how to protect yourself against that. So that's a use case. Let's say problematic, it's going to become even more problematic as there's a big discussion today about creating agentic AI, meaning AI that acts automatically on systems. And that raises even more concerns. Because often to take actions like being able to book train tickets, for example, you often need to have access, credit card or things like that, or things that are shared in the chat, for example. There are agents that are used to manipulate code. So there could be things in the code or in files in the code folder. Secret keys to be able to access production servers, for example, that kind of thing. And if this data is given to these agents can then use it and potentially misuse it.
Soit une mauvaise utilisation.
Or even exfiltrate it. So there are quite a few. For example, today there are many agentic browsers, agentic web browsers, and almost all of them have been attacked. So the web browsers, there are plenty of secrets installed inside. I don't know if you register on a social network or on your bank account, that kind of thing. There are secrets and these agents could use them. And the tricky thing is that they can carry out their actions. These agents can use the content of the web pages they visit. But now what if there are malicious instructions injected by an attacker in the web page they visit? These instructions can tell the agent, for example, to send authentication secrets to a third party via an internet address. So in this case, it greatly increases a lot of very serious cybersecurity problems.
So how does an attacker go about making a large language model or an agent deviate from its basic function?
The most commonly used attack today is what's called prompt injection. The idea is that an AI agent is basically a chatbot, but with additional features. You give it some text and it will be able to read that text and take actions based on it. And the difficulty is that it's very hard. And even from a theoretical point of view, it's not clear whether it's possible for the agent to understand the difference between the fundamental instructions we wanted to give it or the ones the user gave it. And other information that's on the website, for example, or data it has visited. That contrasts quite a bit with classic cybersecurity. In classic cybersecurity, there's a very common attack called SQL injection. It's a programming language that's very close to databases and SQL injection. For example, if you have a form where you enter the username and the password, this data will then be reused to make an SQL query to try to find it in the website's database. If the user exists, that kind of thing. Now, a malicious user might want to try to enter SQL injections in the username field. For example, SQL can say username and he can add more. And then, for example, go look in the database for the date of birth of one person, the credit card number of another. And what if the site is poorly made? This instruction is exactly as it appears in the SQL statement, which will allow retrieving data from the database and then sending back the response to these instructions. But since we now have a lot of experience in the field and we know it's a major attack, there are many systems that will do what is sometimes called sanitization in English, or making it safe in French. So the user's instruction, and therefore removing the SQL interpretation of that. And since the SQL language is very well made and very well defined, we know exactly how to do it. Unfortunately for LLMs, today we don't have the equivalent. We don't know how to do sanitization. So making it safe of instruction, giving a chatbot, that's what makes us very vulnerable to prompt injections. And so today, with an agentic browser, it's enough for the browser, well, for the user at some point to visit a page, which in fact was not trustworthy, controlled by an attacker, so that suddenly they become very vulnerable. Actually, it's even more insidious than that, because even regular websites like Le Monde France, for example, embed ads in their pages. And the ads, you have to buy them to share information through advertising. So there are even on regular pages that you might think are trustworthy. There is potentially a way for cyber criminals to inject malicious instructions.
And we have ways to defend against that, because it's still a gaping hole in security with AIs.
Yeah, so it's a cat and mouse game, meaning that so clearly now companies have understood that it's a problem, even if they keep deploying systems. While finally acknowledging, really, for example, Google anti-gravity, which makes code, well, software to make code that is agented. So really, they released it. The next day, there was the critical vulnerability published by Google themselves. I mean, they couldn't even hide it, right? So they're clearly aware of the problem. It doesn't stop them from continuing to deploy these systems, and clearly they're trying to find workarounds. So typically what they'll do is say, I'll try to clearly define the part that's the web page, for example, that I'm visiting by putting tags on the left and right. Ultimately, it's always a cat and mouse issue, especially if these tags need to be added. The attacker can try to close the tags, and then it just becomes normal text again. So there's really a cat and mouse game that's quite complicated, it seems. In any case, there is no security proof like we have for SQL. These are languages that are much less formal. Well, it's much more statistical, and there are fewer rules, which makes it much more difficult from a cybersecurity point of view to set boundaries, demarcations.
Especially since here we're talking about problems that are directly related to the large language model, whereas autonomous agents are kinds of LLMs. But they have access to many more tools, a lot more space, so they can potentially multiply the sources of virus infection, but also their capacity for harm. Could we even imagine an infected AI that could then spread?
Yes, absolutely. So that's the idea. It's actually, we have a lot more. Well, already, for example, there's Google, which has an agents-to-agents protocol, where the idea is already to allow agents to interact with each other. So imagine lots of agents interacting with each other. You have access to information to an injection to one of these agents. You can give the instruction to this agent to repeat an attack to all the agents as well, by asking these agents to in turn repeat the attack. So it's really like email chains. So back then, it's been a long time since I've seen one, but back then there was really that aspect. You have to share this email with someone else, or else bad luck will come to you, that kind of thing. And all it takes is for 1 out of 6 people to share this email 7 times. So that the spread is exponential, 7/6 each time it's forwarded. And with exponential growth, it quickly reaches a lot of people. That's really the viral aspect. It's truly the word virus. It's really the same math equations as epidemics. And so there's really this problem, agent by agent, which today is still far from being solved. We don't really know how to do it, and as a result, that also limits things. Another aspect is that a classic defense in cybersecurity is what's called compartmentalization with least privilege. That means there are several features on a computer or in software, and we're going to try to compartmentalize each feature, so that if one compartment is infected, it stops at that part. And so with regular software, there are still a lot of vulnerabilities, but we've made a lot of progress in cybersecurity with this kind of principle. And so there are people who have tried to replicate this with agents, saying that each agent has certain rights. Some can access the internet, others can access the computer's files. And by compartmentalizing like that, we can hope to reduce the risks. But the problem is that as is often the case, the agents communicate and communicate arbitrarily. It's very difficult to filter. That is to prevent one agent from telling another agent to do something malicious, knowing he's still expected to ask him to do things. So that's where it makes the cybersecurity of these agentic systems very complicated.
Especially since now the world has become more and more interconnected. In terms of AI, it's a bit like a game of cat and mouse, except the mouse seems to be moving much faster than the cat right now.
Also, that's because systems are being deployed very quickly, and that's a problem that's not specific to digital technology. In every industry, there have been new technologies deployed sometimes very quickly. We thought about pesticides. We can think about the sugar industry, which put sugar everywhere. We can think about tobacco. And regulation already, scientific research is often behind. It's complicated. We realize that we need large samples. We're always a bit late. And then regulation comes much later. So we're really in this phase, and in all other industries, what has been done is that there's a principle of presumption of non-compliance. That means if you build a plane today, it wasn't the case in 1930, but today if you build a plane, the plane isn't allowed to take off. To get flight authorization, you actually have to show that the plane meets the safety standards of the aeronautics field. It's the same thing for water quality, for food and for products. Today, the standard is at the European level, which means that products, in order to be marketed at least at the European level, most products must first be inspected before they are allowed to be sold.
Okay.
Today, in the digital sector, as we can see, that's not the case at all. The new version of any chatbot or recommendation AI is deployed without anyone even noticing. Sometimes a week later, we realize our interface must have changed. L'app a dû changer.
Right.
And that's a real vulnerability. That means if tomorrow tensions keep rising, well, today we're recording this interview. There are increasingly pressing threats from the President of the United States, especially regarding Greenland. Tensions with Europe are rising. In any case, digital technology gives Americans extremely powerful means to cause harm. So I think these are issues where it's really important to radically increase our standards of security and sovereignty.
We hear a lot about the General Data Protection Regulation, Are there any regulations that allow AI to be regulated in Europe, or for now, is there really not much?
In Europe, regarding AI, there is the AI Act, which is the main piece of legislation on AI. There are also things that are more oriented towards social networks and marketplace platforms, like the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. And in all these cases, the law is complex. I don't claim to have mastered it, but it is, from what I understand, at least when I read it. Either way, it's very radical if we applied the law as it stands today. To give an example, the AI regulation, which was published, I don't remember the exact dates, but a few years ago, which came into effect. A few years ago in this regulation, there are the AIs. There are several categories of AI, so there are high-risk AIs, especially where there are quite significant requirements. And then there's another class, which is the class of prohibited AIs. And the first criterion for prohibited AIs is that any AI is prohibited, at least in principle. So I'm paraphrasing, and I'm not a lawyer, but to paraphrase, it says that any AI is prohibited. That has the purpose or effect of manipulating users without their consent, and that can harm them. Let me rephrase. I'm very sorry for the lawyers. I know that's not exactly it, but really, that's how it is. There's also a subliminal aspect well below the threshold of perception. And I read that, I contrast that. For example, with the report that came out about the Commission, TikTok in France, which is incendiary on TikTok, and where they're really talking about manipulation, even intentional, young people, to push them to consume more. TikTok with modification, really of their own. I feel like one would involve banning TikTok's AIs, something like that, you know. And we can ask ourselves the same question about chatbots. So chatbots, especially character AI, which basically uses ChatGPT to create chatbots embodied in fictional characters. There have been several cases where this kind of chatbot was considered responsible. And in fact, there have been cases of incitement to suicide, with suicide actually happening afterward. In any case, that's really manipulation. So there's a pretty striking contrast, I think, between the law and the facts. And for me, well, it's not just for me, a lot of legal experts say this. The big challenge is no longer regulation. I mean, when it comes to passing laws, the big challenge now is enforcing the laws. And it's really complicated because on the other side, there's really the President of the United States, several times. Recently, he went after Thierry Breton, who was at the European Commission, who was especially leading the work on the Digital Services Act, which is very focused on social networks, very strict. Donald Trump personally went after him. I mean, banning from territories, especially the United States. But more generally, there is really a lot of pressure now coming from the United States not to enforce digital laws in Europe. It's true that it's becoming complicated.
Especially since earlier we were also talking about the fact that these algorithms were being updated, que les IA étaient mis à jour, that we are aware of it, which is also completely the case for recommendation algorithms that are regularly updated, with rules that we don't necessarily have control over, which don't always work in people's best interests. How can stakeholders interact with Europe and the States to try to show more transparency? Are there any initiatives currently underway?
The Digital Services Act text has a lot of good aspects. I still think it doesn't go far enough, though it does go pretty far. In the text, and in particular, there is a clause that is supposed to allow any independent researcher, upon request, to access a lot of data from these industries. To my knowledge, it hasn't been applied at all yet. It's been several years now. I believe the Digital Services Act has been in effect. Donc, il y a point, and even more so in the enforcement of the law. And for me, there's something important in the fact that I acknowledge it. That is to say, if you look at any industry that today is considered part of the market, industries of doubt that have hidden scientific truths. For example, I take oil, tobacco, sugar. There were leaks, internal documents from these industries, from all these industries, that show these industries were aware of the problems. Decades before scientists were aware of the problem, so internal documents that were already very incriminating, and so these industries knew about it long before the scientists did. So that also raises the question of what approach the scientists took, because they could have been more cautious more quickly. No, but with all that, what should we do, knowing this story? We should expect that it won't be any different in the digital industry, that there will be many things hidden from us. And actually, we can already see it through leaks. There have also been document leaks, especially from Facebook, the Facebook files in 2021, which are extremely compromising for Facebook. And we really see Facebook, which finally acknowledges the internal documents that recognize that Instagram in particular causes very serious mental health issues. So that's where transparency is really, really, really important to demand today. And in the absence of transparency, because it's going to be very complicated, it's still going to take years. I think it's urgent to adopt Bayesian reasoning and to say that there is a presumption to be made that these companies are hiding things from us that are very compromising for them. And one way to take advantage of that is to reverse the burden of proof, so the presumption of non-compliance, and to say to these industries, we will consider you to be illicit until you have proven that you are lawful, just by reversing the burden of proof.
So, the Bayesian approach could be a solution to improve our relationship with algorithms by encouraging us to be more proactive in our approach.
So there are several aspects where it's interesting. The first is to have this suspicion of reasoning with probabilities. And so I think that if we reason with probabilities, Knowing the history of industries, we come to the conclusion that it's concerning that it's so opaque. So that's one aspect. Then there are other aspects that are interesting in relation to Bayesianism in particular. Another aspect is reasoning much more with uncertainty. So let's imagine that he proposes two imaginary worlds. The first is that the digital industries greatly worsen democracy through the amplification of misinformation and hate. And then there's the other imaginary world where their impact isn't that significant. I think that from a Bayesian point of view, we have to reason with probabilities anyway. So we can't be sure that we're living in the first world. But it seems unreasonable to me to say that there's not a significant probability that there is indeed a very negative impact on democracy. And so knowing that, the thing is, if we intervene in these systems and significantly reduce them, for example, if we require much more transparency from them, we invest a lot in alternatives that would allow us to create a much healthier digital environment. So it would represent a cost, but it's a cost that in one of these two worlds would have a lot of value, and in the other world, well, it would have a cost, but it's not a catastrophic cost. When we imagine these two possible worlds, one has a very positive effect and the other a slightly negative one. But that's okay, right? And so when we reason with uncertainty, then we look at both sides a bit, and overall it gives the impression that it's rather a good thing to do. It's also this reasoning with uncertainty, in particular anticipating the worst cases, even if their probability isn't huge. It's also one of the aspects. Many people, I think, would benefit from saying, well, it's kind of the precautionary principle in a way. But as long as there's enough uncertainty, at least, about whether something is very, very serious, that's enough to give a lot of attention to that thing. That's kind of one of the important aspects of business.
So, do the algorithms of different social networks play a role in the rise of conspiracy theories in general? That is, the misinformation and the distrust that people have towards science and more traditional institutions?
I think the first thing to mention is that there's a group I like to mention. It's the Videm Institute. Sometimes I describe them a bit like the mini intergovernmental panel on climate change of democracy. It's not at all on the level of the intergovernmental panel on climate change. They don't have the resources of the intergovernmental panel on climate change at all. But they try to make an annual assessment of the state of democracies around the world. And a few years ago, there were still headlines where it was, I think it was in 2017, something like that. There was a headline, it was Democracy for All, where there was still a positive trajectory of the global democratization of the world. Then I think in 2021, it was something like Dictatorship Goes Viral. And generally, we look, there are quite a few other indicators, for example, some United Nations indicators as well, about the credibility of elections, for example, or the integrity of elections, the coherence of parliaments, or things like that. These are statistics where we see that throughout the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, things were really moving in the right direction. The world was improving dramatically. We could see that poverty in the world was declining in a spectacular way. And then starting from 2012, something happened. From 2012 to 2015, the trends reversed. And since 2012, 2015, it's been the same, the sentiment as well. The trends reversed and went in the right direction. No more dictatorship, that kind of thing. And so 2012 was really the massive adoption of social networks. It was even right after the Arab Spring, in the sense that for a long time at the beginning, social networks were really seen as a vehicle for democratization and freedom of speech. And then there were the Arab Spring, there were different pro-democracy movements around the world. And then after the Arab Spring, there was much more an exploitation of social networks, not only by dictatorships, but also a much greater pursuit of profit, a growing closeness between social networks and dictatorships. And as a result, correlation isn't causation, but there's a strong link between widespread social network use and the decline of democracies. That's an important point. While correlation isn't causation, it does raise the likelihood of causation. And then there are many explanatory mechanisms, some of which are quite obvious, like the involvement of false information. 10 years ago, what is happening today would have been unimaginable. almost a year ago, what is happening today would have been unimaginable. But there are really things happening that are quite unimaginable and that are very much linked to the spread of information. So there is clearly an explanatory mechanism there is. And then what? There are also other signs that are quite concerning about the growing closeness between certain authoritarian powers and digital technologies. So historically, I would have only given the example of China, but China uses digital technology a lot to serve its power, which is also central and authoritarian. But more and more, we also see this in the United States, where Donald Trump gathered all kinds of tech leaders at the White House. And then more recently, there was 2 leaders from OpenAI, a leader from Palantir, and a leader from Facebook, who were made lieutenant colonels in the United States Army. So it shows that today digital technology is very close, or at least a lot of digital technology is very close to authoritarian power.
And are there other approaches, other ways to make these algorithms work, at least the recommendation algorithms we see on social networks? To avoid these problems, maybe more democratic approaches?
Yes, there's a case I like to mention that's quite spectacular. It's the National Gendarmerie. In France, I think it was in 2009, so the National Gendarmerie said they shouldn't be dependent on a foreign country. And so they left Microsoft and launched Ubuntu, which is a Linux distribution derived from Ubuntu. An open source software which has been used by the National Gendarmerie since 2009. It costs less, making it more efficient for the National Gendarmerie. And above all, they don't depend on the Americans if they really want to seriously harm the French military. Today, they still have a lot of rather worrying means to achieve that, so it's possible. And the key is that it's open source software, meaning the code is fully downloaded and on the machine with updates. And all of that can be done in a way. They don't depend on obscure, opaque code provided by a vendor, of which we can wonder if there's still an ally.
There in the coming years, are there any innovations we're expecting in the field?
Yes, at the European level, there are also initiatives to have open source software. So that's European Union open source, which is also derived from Linux. So these are initiatives that are growing around everything related to platforms, social networks, and all that. There are many protocols and solutions that are free and open source that have been developed, including the Activity Protocol, PubTube, and PixelFed. There are quite a few solutions like Boosky, which is based on open source software and open source protocols. What's interesting, especially in the case of Boosky, is that they tried to break things down because free and open source software means that it can be reused by anyone. The license is not restrictive and open source, which means you can see the code et du coup modify it or at least analyze it. And so that's very good, but it doesn't necessarily solve governance issues because the law is free, open source, but it can be exploited by certain lawyers. And in any case, there is a governance problem. We need to know who writes the law under what conditions. So it's important to also think about the governance of these systems. And so for us, one of the important aspects is to break down the different features so as not to centralize everything in one thing whose governance would impact everyone using this software. And so one of the things that Buscoy did very well is to break down the different features of social networks. For example, data storage, even the storage of users' personal data, the storage of published data, collecting all the data, published messages, displaying them on an application, moderating, or creating a recommendation link. All these features were pre-discovered by Buscoy's protocol. And then what's pretty cool is if everyone can try to contribute to these aspects and make them as interoperable as possible. So that's the principle of interoperability. That's what we've done for telecommunications today. If someone is on the SFR network, they can call someone who is on the Orange network. Overall, it works well. That's what the internet is. The network, the internet cables belong to several different companies, but we don't even realize which company we're using because everything is made extremely interoperable. And so I think it's important to do the same with different components, with everything related to Office software as well, because today that's the biggest concern, much more than generative AI. In my opinion, in the professional world, in industries, it's much more about everything related to Office software. In the end, especially cloud services. And there's a big dependence on Microsoft, and it's often expensive to move away from Microsoft because it's a very closed environment and very difficult to make interoperable with anything else. But there are solutions that exist, especially in Switzerland. There's Infomaniac, which has a whole cloud suite that works. And then there's Framasoft, which has developed a lot of solutions for all these aspects. Framadate, Framapad, the whole Framasoft suite. And then more specifically on the recommendation algorithm part, because I still believe that recommendation AIs remain the biggest geopolitical power today. That means you can easily destabilize a country by amplifying certain information much more than others. And most people today use these recommendation AIs much more than any generative pre-trained transformer. And on this aspect, I work on the Tournesol project, which is also free and open source software, where the idea is to collaboratively identify content of general interest. First, recreate a sense of community, because today, with social networks, there are a lot of information bubbles where it's hard to get different communities to communicate except through insults. So recreate a sense of community, but above all, highlight content of general interest. Because today they're just drowned in an information war, where recommendation AIs will highlight conflictual, hateful, and divisive content much more. Which means that today, quality content has become very difficult.
Are there any books you would recommend for those who want to know more about Bayesianism, algorithms, and artificial intelligence?
I write a lot of books about all that, so I'm going to do a bit of self-promotion about Bayesianism. I'm writing the
Formula of Knowledge,
which is really a book that I wanted to write. Much more philosophy than mathematics. It's much more about taking a step back and thinking about what it means to think well, but it's very mathematical, so there are sections that should be noted as difficult and they can be skipped. Finally, I think there are several levels of reading, and if you're very, very good at math, I don't think you'll get bored. You probably won't be able to understand everything on the first try. Nevertheless, so the formula for knowledge then on questions with much higher stakes, social networks and all that. I'm writing a book called The Dictatorship of Algorithms with Jean-Louis Fourquet, where the idea is not only to make an observation, but even more to talk about what we see. For us, the solutions for a healthy digital world are democratic digital solutions. And by democratic, we mean in accordance with the standards of democracy that is based on transparency. That means that in a democracy, laws are public, unlike code in the digital space. But also they are elected by citizens in a secure way. We have this whole system of voter cards, especially to ensure that there are no fake accounts during elections. Only citizens can express themselves, and each can do so only once. These are features that are currently missing in the digital space. There are also considerations of reflection. Ideally, we want thoughtful, informed opinions. That raises the question, today, are we still able to guarantee that in our democracy? Still, it's a democratic ideal to strive for. And so that also means not taking into account the judgments of someone who's panicking on their couch while scrolling, because that's the most common use of digital technology. And then one last aspect for us is to recreate a sense of community, to make sure we can live together again, to reach agreements, and to have cordial disagreements, which has unfortunately become difficult in society. And then otherwise about chatbots and chatbot cybersecurity. I have a book coming out next spring which is closely related to these topics, and it will talk quite a bit about these aspects.
Thank you very much. We can find you on your channel Science for All. We'll add it to the description for those interested. Thanks a lot, Lee, for this fascinating interview.
Thank you.